afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the show, The Politically Social, and I'm your host, Afia. Today we have with us Mr. Peter Kellner. Jon Kellner is an English journalist, former BBC Newsnight reporter, political commentator, and former president of the YouGov opinion polling organization in the UK. He is known for his appearance on TV, especially at election times. He's also been a visiting fellow at Nuffield College, Oxford, and Institute for Policy Studies, London, and has advised several large corporations. He's the chairman of NCVO, National Council for Voluntary Organisations, and a visiting scholar at Carnegie Europe. In 2011, he received a special recognition award from the Political Studies Association for his achievement in bringing polling and intelligent use of numbers and figures in the election coverage. Welcome, Mr. Kellner.
I'm pleased to talk to you up here.
Thank you so much. Our topic today is what forced Borris Johnson to resign. Let's talk about the accusations against MP Chris Pincher, who was accused of groping two men some years back. In 2019, Mr. Johnson apologized for appointing him as a deputy chief whip, despite being specifically made aware of that complaint. What is your take on that?
The fall of Borris Johnson reminds me of something that Ernest Hemingway wrote in the 1930s about bankruptcy. He said bankruptcy happens slowly, then suddenly. And the demise of Borris Johnson as Prime Minister at the end was an almost, not quite trivial, but minor scandal, really. Major for the people concerned about a Tory government minister who was groping a young man, and Borris Johnson failing to deal with it. But it came after month of issues to do with Borris Johnson's credibility, his truthfulness, his judgment, his decency. And we were reaching the point where something was going to tip him over the edge. It happens to be the Chris Pincher episode, but it might have been something else.
Right, and Mr. Johnson even went to a bring your own booze party in the Downing Street garden during the very first lockdown. How bad was the impact of that?
That was pretty bad. It wasn't the only incident where Borris Johnson was involved in gatherings in Downing Street, where the Prime Minister headquarters are, in violation of the rules that Borris Johnson himself had imposed during the period of the COVID pandemic. But the real reason why it damaged him so much was a growing sense that Borris Johnson was one of those people who thinks, a bit like that Laura Helmsley decades ago in America, who said taxes are for little people when she was imprisoned for tax evasion. Borris Johnson has gone through life thinking rules are for other people, not for him. And what offended many people was that ordinary people up and down the country, they couldn't say farewell to their dying mother or father or sister or husband or wife because they were keeping to the rules. Whereas Borris Johnson was taking part, not in mammothly outrageous social gatherings, but in gatherings that were quite clearly in breach of the rules that other people in far more depressing and distressing circumstances, they kept to the rules.
Right, and a report by Sue Gray described a series of similar social events by political staff that broke down lockdown rules. But do you think that also reflects very poorly on Mr. Johnson as a leader of the country?
Absolutely. I mean, the thing about Borris Johnson, you've got to understand, is that he's essentially been like this all his life. When I say being like this, I mean somebody who is simply cavalier about rules and conventions and decent behavior. When he was at Eton, Britain's probably most famous, one of the most exclusive schools, his schoolmaster wrote when Borris Johnson was, 15 or 16, that Borris Johnson does not appear to respect the rules and conventions that everybody else adheres to. And you go through his life. He was sacked from one newspaper for making up a quote from somebody who had never said what he said. He was sacked from the Conservative front bench in opposition by the then leader Michael Howard for just telling lies about an affair that had been reported. Boris Johnson has, throughout his life, done and said whatever is convenient to him at the moment. And in the end, it caught up with him.
Right. And again, do you think Mr. Johnson knowingly misled the parliament and the people when he claimed that all of the COVID-19 guidelines were really followed?
The key word, Afia, in your question, and it's a key part of what is now being discussed in Parliament, is the word knowingly. Mm-hmm. Now, a great film from 60 years ago, which some of your older viewers and listeners may recall or have seen more recently, is Lawrence of Arabia, a great epic about T. Lawrence, the Brit who tried to help the Arabs during the First World War. And he comes across in the film a cynical British civil servant. And Lawrence accuses the civil servant of telling lies. And the civil servant replies, yeah, a man who tells lies like me merely hides the truth. But a man who tells half lies has forgotten where he put it. And that's, in a sense, Boris Johnson. He's forgotten where he put it. To put it in a more clinical terms, there's a condition called mythomania, in which people really say whatever comes into their minds, simply not knowing whether they're lying or telling the truth. Now, I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a doctor, so I'm not saying that is precisely a medical condition that applies to Boris Johnson, but he certainly acts as if the truth is a minor convenience or sometimes inconvenience, and he's not terribly bothered by the truthfulness of what he says. So whether he knowingly, he clearly misled Parliament. The question is whether he knowingly misled Parliament, and to knowingly mislead Parliament implies that you do have in yourself a capacity to understand what truth is. And I'm not entirely sure that Boris Johnson has that capacity.
Right. That's very interesting. Moving on to a different area specifically, despite Russia's invasion of Ukraine and inflation rising at such a fast pace, there was still a tax rise back in April of this year in the UK. On what basis do you think Boris Johnson's government made that decision?
The tax rise in the spring was for a very specific purpose, and it's followed years of debate. And the issue it was trying to address was the social care of older people who can no longer look after themselves and need to be in some kind of home or institutional setting where they can be looked after. It's been very badly underfunded for years. It's agreed across the political parties in Britain that that's the problem, but there's nobody up to now has grasped the issue and said, this is what it'll cost to put it right, and this is how we will find the money. And this train was coming down the track of sorting out the social care financing issue for a good long while. And it happened, and it just so happened that the people at the top of government, including Boris Johnson, came to the agreement around the time that Russia invaded Ukraine, which set off all the other things you mentioned, the rise in energy prices, the rise in inflation, and therefore the cost of living, the fall in people's living standards. And so when you look at the tax rise out of its own context, it looks like people are being punished through higher taxation just when they can least afford it. But in a sense, I would almost give Boris Johnson credit for doing what previous prime ministers for some years have not done, which is finding a way to fund this money. But of course, now it has become deeply controversial because it is just about now that this tax rise is coming into effect. I think it was just a few weeks ago. And so people are seeing their take-home pay going down at a time when their fuel bills are getting ever more expensive. So it has become a really tricky issue. But social care has to be paid for. or we're going to suffer the grotesque spectacle of more and more elderly people simply not getting the kind of minimum care they really ought to have.
Right, right, right. So the Conservatives, led by the Prime Minister, voted to pause MP Owen Paterson's suspension. Now, they set up a new committee, despite an existing committee by the House of Commons recommending this suspension. Boris Johnson later then agreed that he crashed the car while handling the case. What, in your opinion, made him do that? And what exactly does he mean when he says he crashed the car?
Right, let's go back, I think, to the origin of this. Owen Paterson, who used to be a Conservative government minister and was a great supporter and fan of Boris Johnson, he was found to have improperly used his position as MP to promote a company that was paying him some money without fully declaring it. And under British parliamentary rules, that is one of the worst sort of crimes an MP can commit, because the convention is when you speak in the House of Commons or the House of Lords, you say what you believe to be the case, not what is in your financial interest to say. Right. Now, when this came out, Boris Johnson wanted to support an alternative fees. So he tried to get Parliament to the minimum punishment, virtually no punishment at all, so Owen Paterson could carry on, but he misjudged a lot of his own party. So a lot of the Conservative MPs in London, in Westminster, not all of them, but enough of them said, we won't put up with this. Owen Paterson really has broken the rules, and it brings us all into disrepute if we don't punish him. So over a 24-hour period, Boris Johnson had to reverse his position, and it became very clear that he'd acted wrongly. And in the end, Owen Paterson resigned as a member of Parliament. There was a by-election, I think what you call in America a special election, to choose his successor, and the Conservatives, it was a very, very safe, very strong Conservative seat, but they lost it to the Liberal Democrats. And that was one of the many issues that is on Boris Johnson's record. When I said at the beginning of this discussion, in the end, a whole succession of things came to a head quite suddenly. Well, the Owen Paterson saga was one of the things that contributed to it coming to a head a few weeks ago.
Absolutely. And do you question Boris Johnson's policies as a prime minister?
Look, cards on the table. When I report on polls and elections, I try to do as impartially and objectively as possible. But anybody who knows me know that I'm not a Conservative. So your viewers, your listeners should bear that in mind. I'm also strongly pro-European, and Boris Johnson was the Prime Minister who, in the end, as he put it, got Brexit done, made sure that Britain did leave the European Union. So you can call the fact that he completed Brexit either a success if you wanted it to happen, or a failure if you didn't want it to happen. But the curious thing about Boris Johnson is that he has very few deeply held political principles of his own. And I don't necessarily mean that as a criticism. I mean, some of the worst political leaders around the world over the last 100 years are people with excessively strong political passions who carry them through and do a lot of damage. So to come ideologically light is not a bad thing. And without wishing to comment too much on American politics, I suspect many American voters would wish more of their politicians on both sides of the aisle were a bit less ideologically passionate than they are. Close brackets, disregard that remark if you wish. But Boris Johnson has always been in an odd way pragmatic. And indeed, Europe is a very good example, because when the referendum was held on whether to stay in the European or leave it and go for Brexit 6 years ago, Boris Johnson was not in the government, and he was writing a weekly column for the Daily Telegraph in London. And when he was having to make up his mind how to vote on Brexit, he drafted two columns for Telegraph, one saying why we should stay in the EU and the other saying why we should leave the EU. And in the end, he published the why we should leave the EU. But the fact that he wrote the two columns before making up his mind showed that this was not a policy of profound conviction, but what he in the end decided was in the country's or possibly his own political interest, how to go.
Right. So as you just said, Boris Johnson was all about getting Brexit done, but this right after this, his Conservatives the Conservatives won with an 80-seat majority. What is your take on that?
You're right. Let's just get the timeline. In July 2019, Boris Johnson becomes Prime Minister, and in December 2019, so 5 months later, there's a general election. Now, there was certainly relief that Boris Johnson was getting Brexit done, but the big reason why he won so heavily was because Labour was led by an utterly unelectable leader called Jeremy Corbyn, somebody I'd known for 40 years. When we were both young, we were both active members in the local Labour Party in a part of North London called Hornsey and Wood Green. And he was the same then as he is now, which is an utterly committed and convinced extreme left-winger, a Marxist. And I don't say that in itself as a criticism. I think he was wear the label Marxist with some pride. In more recent times, he's been writing columns for the communist daily newspaper, the Morning Star. And he was elected by the Labour Party membership in circumstances which I think would start to bore me to go into in great detail. But the Labour Party at a particular moment 7 years ago had this great lurch to the left. And they elected him, to everybody's surprise, as the party leader. And he was never, ever going to win an election. And so the 2019 election, anybody who feared Jeremy Corbyn backed the Conservatives. Boris Johnson's was not that popular at the time. He wasn't unpopular, as he has been more recently, but his ratings were, there's a myth that Boris Johnson was supremely popular in 2019 when he won that election. It's not true. He had middling ratings, not great ratings, but the reason the Conservatives won big rather than won narrowly was mainly because of Jeremy Corbyn.
Right. So in the UK, does having a majority mean that the government can win any parliamentary vote?
It can win any votes when the Conservative majority is united. The Conservatives, if you take Congress at the moment, ahead of the midterms, the majority is quite small. If the Democrats stay together as they did on the recent climate change and infrastructure vote, the Democrats can win. Well, the Conservatives can do that for the same reason, with even better numbers in London. But when the Conservatives are not together, then they're of trouble, as happened over the Owen Paterson case. Now, the one thing I would say is that throughout my 50 years of covering politics in Britain, but looking at politics abroad, it has always been like this in Britain, in that there is usually reasonably good party discipline most of the time. In America, that's relatively new. I mean, when I was first taking interest in American politics in the era of Kennedy and Johnson and Nixon and Reagan, you tended to have much less party discipline in Washington, in Congress, and the Senate, much more negotiation across the aisle. Joe Biden, after all, built up his early reputation as somebody building majorities across the aisle in the Senate. It's never really been like that in Britain. It was for a while over Brexit between 2016 and 2019, but that's an exception. Broadly, party discipline holds on the big issues. So if you've got a majority of 80, then most of the time you can get your way pretty comfortably.
Right. And what do you think led to Mr. Johnson losing the support of a lot of Conservative MPs? Were they really tired of all the scandals?
I think two things, in a sense, came together. The first was, as we've been discussing over the last short while, a succession of issues happened. Owen Paterson, the tax rises, the controversies over the way Brexit, the fallout from Brexit was being handled. There were there was the socialising during the pandemic, the rule breaking, and so on. Then the Chris Pincher event, and these were progressively weakening Boris Johnson. But at the same time, the polling was showing increasingly that Boris Johnson was increasingly disliked by the general public. Now, politicians in Britain, and I don't know whether it's the same in America, certainly in Britain, they will, if asked about the opinion polls, they say, I never take any notice of opinion polls. The only poll that matters is the one on election day when people vote. But of course, it's tosh. Politicians follow the polls very closely. And it's become increasingly clear in the last 6 months that Boris Johnson was increasingly toxic with the wider public. The Conservatives were losing special elections, like the one following the Owen Paterson affair. There was another one more recently, another sort of rather weird sex scandal where a guy was watching porn, claiming that he was trying to look for a website on tractors. Anyway, he resigned. They held special election there. Another safe Conservative seat, another Liberal Democrat gain. Labour were taking a seat in the north of England in another special election. So the evidence from elections and from opinion polls was saying day by day, certainly week by week, to Conservatives, you're going to lose the next election if you keep Boris Johnson. Now, no Tory MP will publicly say we kicked Johnson out because he was no longer electable. But that was certainly a significant part of it.
And amid all this, were his opponents really able to target his authority as a prime minister? I mean, how has that changed while we wait for another politician to take over as the new prime minister of the UK?
Well, once a prime minister has announced their resignation, then there is a pretty strong convention in British politics that just as actually during a general election campaign of about 4 weeks, remember our election campaigns in Britain are much shorter than in the States, there's a convention that no significant new policies are decided or announced. And we're in that period now. Now, the odd thing is until, 20 years ago, the leaders of political parties were chosen by the members of parliament, not by the local party membership. And now they're all chosen by local party membership. And it means that when a prime minister decides to resign or is forced to resign, it takes weeks and weeks and weeks to go through the process of getting a new leader. So we now have a quite long period, which will end up being 2 months between the announcements by Boris Johnson he's going to resign and his actual departure, which will be in the beginning of September. Again, I'm not sure of the precise procedures in Washington, but I think people would be surprised if a president did anything big that he wasn't forced to between election day in November and the inauguration day of his successor in January. I think the convention, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, convention is that sort of Washington almost closes down in terms of brand new big policies. And we're in that position in Britain, certainly at the moment. There was a fear that when Boris Johnson was forced to stand down, that he would somehow exact his revenge by ignoring that convention and using his powers to the full. And one of the differences between Britain and America is that America, pretty well everything is written down, either in the Constitution or in form or Supreme Court judgments or whatever. Britain, it's not written down quite like that. We operate by a system of understandings and conventional practice in history. So I don't know of any rule that says Boris Johnson could not abolish income tax or nuke Moscow. But he isn't doing that, he won't do that. And if he were to have a brainstorm and try, I think the system would close in around him and stop him doing anything like that.
Right. Uh, so UK's finance minister and the health secretary both resigned, citing Boris Johnson's lack of integrity as one of the reasons. Why do you think that happened? Why do they say lack of integrity specifically?
Well, this is where you come to the point that a whole lot of things have built up, but the specific issue was the Chris Pincher and Boris Johnson's failure to deal with that. And that particular issue was one of the issues of integrity. But integrity was also present, in Patterson saga, in the so-called Partygate, the socializing during the pandemic, and there have been other issues. I think the problem for the Conservatives now is that I would regard it as a bit late to say they've only suddenly discovered that Boris Johnson was a wrong one. It's been clear for decades, since he was at school, that he's a wrong one. They knew when he elected him as their party leader and prime minister that he was somebody who could not be relied on to tell the truth, that he was cavalier about keeping rules. And yet they did elect him because they thought he could win the election, and indeed he did, albeit against a very weak Labour Party. They're in the odd position that if anybody, I would expect Liz Truss to be the next prime minister. She's ahead, but even if it's Rishi Sunak, they're the two rivals. But whoever's the next prime minister, if they were to be questioned rigorously on their view of Boris Johnson before the days and hours leading up to his resignation, they stuck around in his cabinet for years. So did they not realize what sort of character he was? It came as a surprise to absolutely nobody that Boris Johnson was somebody who couldn't rely to tell the truth, couldn't be relied on to do what was right. No surprise at all.
And we saw more resignations after these two. But do you think these resignations are destroying his authority as a prime minister, or that still remains intact?
Oh, well, it's one of the reasons why Boris Johnson is now, I think this week, he's just gone on his second holiday in about 3 weeks. I think the resignations did two things. They were the things that forced him out against his will. 24 hours before he announced his resignation, he said he was carrying on and everything was fine. And the second thing it's done is to make it abundantly clear that he couldn't use his remaining weeks while the Conservative Party chose his successor. He couldn't use those weeks to do any substantial new policy. And once he realized that power had actually drained away from him, he sort of more or less went on strike, or at least went on holiday.
Right. So many conservatives oppose his plan of remaining in office until a new leader is chosen. But the prime minister really gets appointed by the monarch and not through parliamentary votes. So do these oppositions even matter much?
The short answer is no. There was no way he could be forced to resign immediately. But that's almost beside the point. You're right, technically, the monarch appoints the prime minister, but the monarch only acts on the advice of the government. And that means the advice of the prime minister. So the only way Boris Johnson could resign is by going to the Queen and saying, I advise you to accept my resignation this minute. And there was no way he was going to do that. But let me say, because even in Britain, people get this a bit wrong. What a lot of people are saying is there are only 160,000 Conservative Party members out of a UK population of something like 67 million. Tiny proportion. So why should they choose who's in charge of our government? But actually what happens is that when the Conservative membership decides whether it's Liz Truss or Rishi Sunak, what will then happen is the Conservative Party in Parliament, the Conservative members of Parliament, they will approve the choice of the party membership.
Mhm.
And that means that whoever it is will have majority support in the House of Parliament. So what will happen then is Boris Johnson will go to the Queen and say, I am now resigning, and I advise you to appoint Rishi Sunak or Liz Truss, whoever's won it. But the basis on which he will make that recommendation is that the winner will command the authority of a majority in Parliament. If this isn't going to happen, in a fanciful case, supposing the leadership contest had so divided the Conservative Party that it's split in two, and that there weren't enough people who accepted the decision of the Conservative Party members, then the Queen probably wouldn't select the leader. We'd be in a messy, very, very messy constitutional dilemma. But the formal thing is who can command a majority in the House of Commons. And as long as Conservative MPs accept the majority of those 160,000 local party members, that creates the condition for the winner of that vote to be selected by the Queen to be the new Prime Minister.
So can we say that in the UK, general elections work like congressional elections?
In one sense, yes, and in one sense, no. Yes, in the sense that Congress has whatever it is, 435, is that right, members, and they represent 435 congressional districts. Whoever comes top in each of those districts becomes the member of Congress. In Britain, we have 650 localities, and whoever comes top in each of the 650 becomes a member of Parliament. That's the similarity. Here's the main difference, that you choose your head of government, the president, directly. It's not it's not whoever Congress decides should be the president. In Britain, the Prime Minister emerges from the majority in the House of Commons. Very, very few people voters voted for Borris Johnson. The only people who voted for Borris Johnson in 2019 were those who lived in the particular part of London that he represents in Parliament. Mm-hmm. I don't live in that part, so I couldn't have voted for Borris Johnson. I could have voted for a different Conservative locally, or Labour, or Liberal Democrat, or Green. Right. So this is the fundamental difference. In Britain, the executive emerges from the legislature, whereas in America, the executive and the legislature are separately elected, mm-hmm. and of course can be in conflict. And what I'm reading is that most people expect, not everybody, but most people expect the Democrats to lose their majority in Congress in 3 months' time in the midterms. Joe Biden will still be president, and you will have, by no means for the first time, one party in charge in the White House, another party in charge in Congress. That's familiar to you. It doesn't happen in Britain.
Interesting. But at this point, is there any chance that there could still be a vote of no confidence now that there are two finalists?
Not in the short run, no. What will happen is the winner will be announced on September the 5th, and most people expect that the next day, on September the 6th, Borris Johnson will go to Buckingham Palace, resign, and Liz Truss or Rishi Sunak will become Prime Minister that day. Incidentally, in Britain, when you do get a change of an executive, it happens suddenly. It's not you don't have this 3-month, leisurely 2 months, 2.5 months between election day and inauguration. In Britain, when you have a changing of the guard politically, it happens instantly. Now, whether there will then be a vote of confidence later on, some weeks or months later, well, that will be a decision that the Labour Party and the Labour opposition party will take. They call a vote of confidence, but I see no prospect of them winning it. So if they hold it, it'll be for demonstration purposes. it won't serve any useful function. The government wouldn't lose a vote of confidence unless something goes completely haywire. The Conservative Party will, at least in a formal sense, come together around the new leader. A lot of their MPs may hate the new leader. They may think that he or she is doing a terrible job. They may disagree on policies. They may not like them personally or whatever. But again, in Britain, basic party loyalty trumps all, except it happens very, very occasionally. It doesn't happen. Then it breaks down and you get a change. I mean, historically, the most famous occasion was in 1940 when Winston Churchill became Prime Minister, because enough of the Conservative majority in Parliament turned against Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister, and he was in the opposition to him, though actually it wasn't the majority opposition to him, the opposition to him was sufficiently great amongst his own side. He resigned. That's how we got Winston Churchill as Prime Minister. But the fact that that's the one case I can think of where a government with a substantial majority on paper, you get that kind of change. You know, it doesn't happen. I suppose that Borris Johnson tried to struggle on last month when so many ministers resigned, then that might have led to a vote of confidence and his departure. But because he realised that time was running out, he had no option. You know, it's just like in chess, when you get to checkmate, you don't actually take the king, but when you know the king, your king is going to fall next move, you admit defeat. Borris Johnson was like the king in a chess match that he just lost.
Right. That's very interesting. Between the two remaining candidates, Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak, who do you think is more competent to replace Borris Johnson, and why?
Right. This is a personal view. I'm not speaking, you know, as a pollster or as an independent analyst. I have a personal view. I think Rishi Sunak is by far the more competent of the two, but I don't think he's going to win. And indeed, what is interesting is the polls that have been done of both the Conservative Party members and more broadly of Conservative voters. Mm-hmm. They all come up with the same interesting pair of findings, mm-hmm. that when you ask who is more prime ministerial or who would be better on the economy, they say Rishi Sunak. When you say who is most in touch with what normal people think, who understands the concerns of people like you, they go for Liz Truss. And Liz Truss is ahead, and she is pretty clearly ahead by a significant amount. Mm-hmm. It's ahead because the people who are making this decision mm-hmm. Want somebody who they feel understands people like them. And Rishi Sunak has the handicap of being incredibly rich, partly his own success and partly his wife's family are incredibly rich, you know, hundreds of billions of pounds, dollars, rich. And whereas for some people, that's to Rishi Sunak's credit, he's somebody who's been successful, and wouldn't it be good to have somebody who's a success running the country? Mm-hmm. A lot of people, especially with what's happening with taxes and with energy prices and inflation and the fact that people are feeling poorer, mm-hmm. it's probably not the best time for a really rich person to be standing as Prime Minister. Had this contest been held a year ago, I think Rishi Sunak would have won easily in a different economic environment, and also at a time when he'd been a very popular Chancellor, Finance Minister, because he'd been doling out lots of money to families and to companies during COVID to keep everybody afloat. And he had very, very high popular ratings. When the taxes went up, and also there were controversies about his wife's tax status, some of the shine came off, and now he's behind.
Right. Both candidates, however, felt that Brexit had nothing to do with what happened, and this whole meltdown, and it was not responsible for this whole meltdown in British politics. Rishi Sunak, as we know, always supported Brexit, but what happened with Liz Truss?
Liz Truss, actually interesting. Liz Truss in the 2016 referendum, when she was a government minister in charge of agriculture, she was strongly in favour of staying in the European Union. There's a speech she gave, which is available on YouTube, which is especially interesting because he wasn't reading out a speech that had been written for her. She was speaking after dinner off her own bat, without notes, and clearly believing every word. And just how important it was for British business and British farmers and British consumers that we remain in the European Union with the benefits of the single market and the customs union and free trade and so on. But since the result, first of all, she said she accepted the results, we were relieved. And now she has decided she got it wrong 6 years ago. And she's now passionately pro-Brexit. And one of the mysteries about Liz Truss is that she has a history through her life of changing her mind on things. This is the most significant thing on which she's changed her mind. So the question is she really now a deeply held anti-European, or is she a bit like Borris Johnson, somebody who actually travels ideologically quite light and decides from time to time what is the most useful, pragmatic position to take? If I may be slightly cynical, I rather hope that she is inconsistent and travels light and is open to her mind being changed. Because in my view, some of her policies on borrowing and on taxation on the economy, I think will be profoundly damaging. And when she becomes Prime Minister, she will be receiving from the Treasury, from the Finance Ministry, detailed analysis of why what she says she wants to do would damage the economy. Now, will she have what will dominate her intellectual ability, which is considerable, to realize that she's got it wrong, or will she be insistent on carrying through what she said in her campaign and do things which most people think will be profoundly economically damaging? I hope she changes her mind.
Hopefully. So how many people are really eligible to vote in the final stage?
This final stage, well, the number is believed to be about 160,000. Nobody's quite certain the exact number. These are simply people who in their own local communities have paid a subscription to join the Conservative Party. So if you work it out, you've got 650 constituencies. So that works out at what about an average of 250 per locality. In some will be much higher, some will be very much lower. What is known, there's not a lot that is known in absolute detail, but where there have been academic studies and surveys, it looks as if about 40%, 2 out of every 5 Conservative Party members are over 65. They're my generation of here, not yours. They are overwhelmingly white. Curiously, although a number of the candidates fighting for leadership, it was pretty even white and non-white, the actual party membership is very white. And it's overwhelmingly in southern England, far fewer in the Midlands, the north of England, Wales or Scotland. So it's a very skewed selection of the British electorate, but they're the people who are making this decision as we speak.
Right. So finally, what exactly is the leadership process in the UK in a nutshell?
Well, each party, it's slightly different. We're dealing with the Conservatives. What happens with the Conservatives is that there are 2 stages. Stage 1 is undertaken by Conservative MPs. So there are 350 or so of them. And what we had was, from memory, 8 candidates wanted to stand. 10 wanted to stand. A couple didn't even get enough nominations. It was then 8, and then it was whittled down in elections by Conservative MPs till we got to the last 2. So the final 2 chosen by MPs were Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak. Rishi Sunak substantially more votes than Liz Truss amongst MPs, but they were the final 2. And those are so that's the end of stage one, is considering MPs choosing the two names to go forward to stage two, and stage two is the election by Conservative Party members. And that takes some weeks because the candidates go around the country, there are various meetings with party members, hustings type meetings, and then people have a time to choose how to vote and send their votes in. Or I think now they can email or post. So that's stage two. We're in the middle of stage two at the moment. My understanding is that most people have now voted. So although there are 2 weeks, maybe over 2 weeks for people still to vote, the probability is the decision has already been made. And if the polls are right, Liz Truss has already won. In the sense that even if everybody who has not yet voted for Rishi Sunak, which is not going to happen, Liz Truss still has enough votes. That's the supposition. So we're really on a strange place where there's an election sort of still going on, but in a sense is probably all over. And the nearest I can offer you is, about 8 o'clock on election evening on November the whatever, when, as it were, it's being decided. But then, last November it took from Tuesday to Saturday before the networks finally decided that Joe Biden has won. But instead of having 4 days of uncertainty, we've got more than 4 weeks of uncertainty, where in fact it's been decided, but it hasn't been declared.
Right. That's very, very interesting to know. Thank you so much for being with us today. This was very helpful, and I think it did educate a lot of us on how things work in the UK. Thank you very much.
A pleasure, Anthea. Good to talk.
Thank you.
Bye.